Good morning from wherever you're tuned in, and welcome to The Leader on Hope TV, courtesy of the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya and the Catalid. This morning we have a very, very interesting and relevant topic. It's all about money. And indeed, all of us could do with a little bit more. And some say that money would cover everything that we need, and money will be the answer to everything, all our matters. Is that so? Well, this morning we have Dr. Reverend Dennis Donggoy, who is the Executive Director of Root to Fruit and Senior Master Facilitator in Kenya. And Root to Fruit is a collaboration of senior executives aiming to transform lives through enabling businesses and nonprofits in Africa to flourish. They equip business leaders to transform culture and deepen trust to grow profits for shared prosperity. Now, our speaker this morning, Dennis, has served as the Business Leadership Manager for the Executive MBA program run by the Copenhagen Business School in collaboration with the Mount Kenya University between 2010 and 2016. Dennis is married to Irene and they have 3 children. He's a gifted speaker and he's widely traveled. And he shares his experiences and has a passion for mission and development of leaders to transform society. He's the author of the popular book, Mixing God with Money, which I have with me. And this is a book that I would encourage you to go to dennisdonggoy.com and read for yourself and see what it says in terms of biblical perspective stewardship of money. Indeed, if I may quote from this book, Mixing God with Money, Dennis says, a poverty mindset rather than lack of resources limits the growth of businesses in Africa. Well, money answers all things, but does it? Over to Dennis Donggoy.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, or wherever you may be at this moment. Thank you very much, Conrad, for that introduction. The passage you've just started me off is actually from the book of Ecclesiastes 10, verse 19, where Solomon, who is one of the wisest men who ever lived, actually quotes and says, "A feast is made for laughter and wine makes merry, but money answers everything." Now, you've got to recognize that Solomon was one of the richest, actually the richest person who ever lived on planet Earth materially. And he spent a lot of time researching and writing and taking the wisdom from the Middle East. And we have the privilege of having that wisdom penned in the wisdom literature in the Bible. Today, our topic, I'll be looking at money, but from a national point of view and looking at how all of us somehow are part of the economy. Because whoever you are, whatever you do, you have to interact with money. Money is a medium that you cannot avoid. So the question comes for us as leaders is, how do we engage with money in a way that advances God's purposes? And one key pillar of building any nation is the economic pillar. And the Bible has a lot to teach us about economics. A friend of mine, who most of you are familiar with on this channel, Bishop Masika, has a farm in Yatta, which is a very, very dry part of this country, and has managed to transform over 4,000 people who lived in poverty to become flourishing agricultural business people by addressing their mindsets. One of the challenges that you find when you go to his farm is a lot of activity going on, but only one farm manager. And I asked him at one point, how do you manage such a large operation? And what he told me, I've never forgotten. He told me it's about the systems. Set together the systems. And he asked me a question, how many people drive a car? And I told him 1. But a vehicle has systems. It has the electrical system, the drivetrain system, it has the fuel system. They're all related together, but it takes one person to drive it. So if we are to talk about money and financing as Christians, we need to, as Christians, look at it from a systemic point of view. And why is this important? It's because Jesus' mandate for us in Matthew 28, 18 to 20 was to disciple the nations. It was a systemic mandate. We have to look at nations and disciple the nations, not plant churches or do Bible studies. Those are important, but the goal is nations be discipled. That is, nations reflect his intentions here on earth, his will being done on earth as it is in heaven. Satan also has a similar strategy with the nations. In Revelation chapter 20, verse 3 and verse 8, the Bible tells us about Satan deceiving the nations. He doesn't not just deceive individuals, he creates systems of deception. And deceptions lead to slavery and entrapment. But kingdom systems lead to freedom. So one is either being deceived or discipling as an individual, as a community, or as a nation. I often told my children that you're either a thermostat, setting the temperature, or a thermometer, picking up the temperature around you. So when it comes to the economy of an individual or a community or a nation, I would say the church is very much at the center of this. Or let me rephrase it. God's people are very much at the center of this. Somebody has rightly said, as goes the church, so goes the nation. If the nation is corrupt, it's because the church is corrupt. If the nation is poor, it's because the church has a poverty mindset. So when the church begins to be the church that Christ meant it to be, we begin to see how nations begin to flourish. And I thank God that over the last 30 years or so, we have testimony of community after community and nation after nation flourishing as they understand what a biblical mindset looks like. The Old Testament gives us several models on a biblical economy. And for those of you who want to read further, there's a book by Landa Kopp called The Old Testament Template. And she talks about how the Old Testament is a template for building nations. Deuteronomy chapter 11 is a key passage when it comes to economic models of how nations are built. And allow me to just read a few verses from Deuteronomy 11 and then unpack those in the remaining time we have in this session. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 8 says, "Therefore be careful to obey every command I'm giving you today, so that you may have strength to go in and take over the land you're about to enter. If you obey, you'll enjoy a long life in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors and to you and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land you're about to enter and take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you planted your seed and made irrigation ditches and with your foot as a vegetable garden. Rather, the land you'll soon take over is a land of hills and valleys and plenty of rain, a land that the Lord your God cares for. He watches it over it through every season of the year. If you carefully obey the commands I'm giving you today, if you love the Lord your God, serve him with all your heart and soul, then he will send the rains in the proper seasons, the early and the late rains, so you'll bring in your harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil. He'll give you large pasture land for your livestock, and you yourselves will have all you want to eat." Now, that passage is a critical foundation for biblical economy. And Brett Johnson, who wrote the book Kingdom Economics, talks about three economic systems based upon God's relationship with his people in the Old Testament. He talks about the system of Egypt, the system of the desert, and the system of the promised land. Now, in that passage, we're talking about people whose economy is functioning and is sufficient based upon certain conditions. But God had taken his people for 430 years here in Africa, in the land of Egypt. Now, what does Egypt represent? In terms of labor, Israel worked for somebody else. They did not work for themselves. Somebody has described this as wage slaves. This mindset is also prevalent in our culture today, where people are very, very happy just to be paid a salary, but not have to think about anything. In this situation, in this passage, The water came from the Nile without fail. They had no anxiety, no worry, except to please their master. In Egypt, the assets belonged to other people. They had no assets except their labor. And this is a system of exploitation. No faith is needed, and those who are part of this system are exploiting one another. The focus is on survival. How do we survive? Both for the oppressor and for the oppressed. You remember Egypt was very concerned when later on Moses came and wanted to take the the Israelites away. How are we going to survive? The focus is on survival. And the prevalent value there is fear. We're afraid of tomorrow. We're afraid of one another. So the Egyptian economic system is prevalent in our context today. But how do you get out of that? God, through Moses, sent the 12 spies to go to look at the promised land. 10 of them came back, and it is fear that kept them enslaved in that context. But 2, because of faith, chose to look at not the problems or the giants, but the God who is above the problems that they will face. They were focused on solving problems rather than the size of their enemies. So the Egyptian economic model is something that is prevalent for individuals, for families, and for nations. I do not know where you are. The next model we see is a desert model. God then delivers his people from slavery, working for others, and brings them into the desert. Why the desert? The desert was a time of purification. Deuteronomy chapter 8, it says, he led them through that vast wilderness so they could test their hearts and see what was in it, to see if they could trust him and if they could know that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. It was a time where they were to walk with God and depend on him daily. It was a time where there was no greed allowed at all. Manna came every day without fail, and if greed allowed them to accumulate more than they needed, the extra bit actually rotted away, and their hearts were purified. And somebody has said, the predominant system here is ethical, doing the right thing. And many of us Christians are stuck in the desert where we're trusting God for miracles day in, day out, and all we're concerned about is have we done the right things or how we're not doing the wrong things. So how do I run my business? I run it ethically. How do I live my life? I live my life ethically. And that becomes our concern. But the challenge for this is that this is still focused on us. And one of the predominant challenges in this particular system is it is still self-serving. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, the prophet talks about Israel's sin. And he says, Sodom's sins were pride, gluttony, and laziness, while the poor and needy suffered outside her door. This can be a system where we're trusting God only for that which is going to help me, pride, me and my family, gluttony, how much I can consume, and also laziness. I'm not willing to put in any effort. But the sadness about this is that the poor within that system are ignored and sidelined and marginalized. So the third system we see is the promised land. What was the promised land system? God was now going to give them their own land, their own assets, so that they could be able to work and enjoy the fruit of their labor. Assets were going to be made available. Land was an asset. And in the promised land system, we look at assets, not just the land, we look at tangible and non-tangible assets. Their obedience to God was going to be key, so I call that a spiritual asset. They also had what we in Root to Fruit describe as social capital. They have natural capital and they have human capital, which is something that's being discussed today by a growing group of Christians at the global level discussing the economics of mutuality. Why is it important to have these assets, tangible and non-tangible assets? Non-tangible assets such as education, such as experience, such as exposure are critical. Non-tangible assets such as health, social capital, trust, natural capital, resources that are not being diminished are critical, because you cannot sustain an economy primarily on just financial capital. Financial capital is the result, not the focus of a kingdom economy. The focus here is redemptive. As opposed to being exploitative or just ethical, is how do we live lives that are redemptive. And this requires faith. In the promised land, the rain was to come on condition that God's people were living in obedience. In Egypt, they didn't have to have any faith. The Nile flowed every year, and they had basically had just to do what their masters had, and the masters fed them. But in the promised land, they worked with their own hands, but if they chose to disobey God or live away from his commandments, the rains failed. And so faith was very, very important. And the passage we just read talks about obedience. Obedience would lead to blessings. Now, this was what God had told his servant Abraham, that he was going to bless him and make him a blessing to every nation. All nations would be blessed through you. And as I said earlier on, as goes the church, so goes the nation. Why has God placed his people in any community? So that as seed of Abraham, they would become a blessing to that community. Not that they would be blessed, but they would become a blessing to that community. One of the challenges we face as God's people today is that we have narrowed down our engagement to what I would describe as the spiritual capital or spiritual dimension of life only. And we forget God's primary agenda to bless the nations. In Hebrews chapter 7, verse 2, talking about Jesus, it talks about Jesus' priesthood. And it's very interesting that the writer of Hebrews says that then Abraham took a tenth of all he had captured in battle and gave it to Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek means king of justice, and the king of Salem means king of peace. Now I want you to reflect on this, because the writer to Hebrews tells us later on that Jesus' priesthood was not of the order of Aaron, but of the order of Melchizedek. What does this mean? Aaron's priesthood was focused on the altar, what you and I would call the pulpit or the spiritual dimension of our life. But Melchizedek's priesthood was based on leadership, on rulership, on justice, and on peace. So when Jesus comes, he does not come to re-establish the Aaronic priesthood. He comes to establish his kingdom. And so when we talk about tithing and money in our current context, we often limit this to how are we going to support or build the church workers, church leaders, but really it should be the other way around. How does the church build the nation economically? We should turn the tables around and realize that under Christ, we're under Melchizedek's priesthood. We're called to be people of justice, to be people who promote peace. And the promised land economy is a land where justice and peace are the focus. The desert, Egypt, was primarily working for others. The desert is trying miracles mostly for myself, but the promised land is how do I create value for others? How do I become a blessing for others? How do we become the instruments of justice and peace? Now, Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." And economic models should be economic models that bring about harmonious collaboration between all the players within the economy. Not exploitative like Egypt, not self-centeredness accumulation like in the desert, but in the promised land where everybody works in a system where the system provides food for everybody. One of the challenges that we have today, because of particularly the secularization and the focus on materialism as the focus of our economy, is we often look at the money and as accumulation and affluence. But the kingdom of God looks at money as service and influence. Not affluence, but influence. Why has God given you that money? What influence does he want you to have for his kingdom? What redemptive purpose has he given that money for? How is that money going to bring about God's redemptive purposes through and in your life? So there are three ways in which we can look at how we relate to the economy. And this is, those of you who want to read a bit further about this, you can look at this at the website redemptivebusinesses.com. And they talk about how you can look at exploitative, and again going back to Egypt, ethical, the desert, and redemptive, which is basically the promised land, being agents of redemption. Work is not only instrumental, producing goods and services, and that it is also relational. As we go and work with our hands, as we go to the marketplace, people see how we relate to one another, how we relate to God's creation, and how we relate to the less disadvantaged. It becomes a powerful witness. Work is a place where we demonstrate God's kingdom from Monday to Saturday. I love it when the provost at All Saints Cathedral a few months ago shared with the congregation and said, the Sunday service is over, church begins tomorrow. And I said, hallelujah. Sunday is a place where we go and we get equipped, we get strengthened. Ministry does not take place in Sunday, except for those very special few people who are called to equip us. But ministry starts when we face the marketplace on Monday. We go there to create and expand the kingdom of God. And we go there under the Melchizedekan priesthood, where we desire to see justice and we desire to see peace. So that the work we actually participate in brings about just relationships and brings about peace among the participants. So on that group website, redemptivebusinesses.com, you will see three things. People, communities, and organizations approach the world in at least three ways. The exploitative way is to take all we can get, to gain advantage, to prevail, to possess. I win, you lose. It's a scarcity mentality. And unfortunately, even as we look at our politics today in Kenya, we still have what I call the Egypt mindset. It's a question of how do we win and you lose? How do I accumulate for myself and disadvantage you? But this is not what the church should be. This is not what God's people should be. Because of our sinful fallen nature, we naturally gravitate towards this exploitative way of relating to each other. The second is what I believe most Christians tend to focus on, is the ethical way of doing things right. They say, I do no harm, I don't break any rules, my business is ethical. But that's basically doing nothing. And it is actually a win-win that yes, you don't lose, I don't lose, but the motivation for this way of working and economic value is basically avoiding anything wrong. Now, for the average Christian, they'll say, that is my testimony. I've been in this business or in this organization, in this company, and look, I've had integrity. But God's way is actually beyond just being ethical. It actually goes towards being redemptive. What does being redemptive means? It is sacrificial service for others. It is a blessing of others, the renewing of the cultures in which we are, the fallenness of the cultures in which we are, and the giving of ourselves sacrificially so that I sacrifice, you win. Rather than let us win, I sacrifice, you win. And that is what we see in the book of Philippians in the New Testament, where Paul talks about Jesus being our model or our example. He says to have the mindset that Christ had, who, although he was equal with God, he had every opportunity, he had every advantage. He did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped or hold on to. He did not hold on to his power, his position, his assets, his resources, but instead, he humbled himself and became obedient. Now, there's the word obedient again. The book of Deuteronomy talked about obedience, and here Jesus Christ, the sinless Son of God, becomes obedient to God and becomes obedient to death on a cross, taking the form of a servant. Now, how do we view our lives as individuals? Do we see ourselves as servants? Do we see our businesses as servers? As I've taught business over the many years and I've engaged with business myself, I mentioned a few challenges and I mentioned a few opportunities. I believe business and creating wealth using the assets God has given us to be a blessing to others is very critical for those of us who are followers of Jesus. Business, to me, is the ultimate servant of the economy because a business looks for needs and problems to solve and solves them sustainably. In the desert model, you're praying for a miracle, but God stopped that when they reached the promised land. The miracle God has given you now is the gifts and the assets that are in your hands. And he's given you his eyes to see what problems can we solve in our society today and solve them sustainably. Is it lack of education? Is it lack of food? Is it value addition to food? Secondly, I've realized that one of the biggest things that destroys economics is not lack of markets, is not poor management, is not lack of money, but it's having a poverty or an unbiblical mindset. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we have worked with companies and businesses at Root to Fruit because we have observed that dysfunctional relationships caused by conflicting values are a root cause of poor performing businesses that result in poverty for all. I have engaged with several businesses, and if you ask why did this business collapse or why is this business not growing, at the bottom of it, you'll find is dysfunctional relationships. It is unbiblical values. People go to work to steal rather than create value. There was a research done by the Aga Khan Foundation, it's rather dated now, about 2016, where they surveyed the youth of Kenya. And in this survey, about 40% of young people go to work to steal. What can I get for myself today? How can I do a deal that makes me very, very rich today? Rather than the kingdom value system where I go to work so I can relate to people and add value. The other 40%, they said they go to work and if they had a chance to steal, they would. So it shows that only about 20% of our young people today between ages 18 and 35 are people you could trust as ethical. But what we're talking about today is going beyond ethical. It's recognizing that God has put you here on earth for a redemptive purpose. Let me finish off with the illustration. What does a redemptive purpose mean? In Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 to 20, the Bible talks about how Christ shed his blood so that he could reconcile all things to himself. And the question I've often asked people is, why did Jesus shed his blood? Was it so that just our souls could go to heaven? But the Bible very clearly says it's so that he could reconcile all things to himself. What does all things mean? All things means all things. So let me ask you a question. Did Jesus Christ die to redeem the motorcycle? Now you say, but that's not in the Bible. Yes, but the question is, today, if you look at Kenya's economy, over 1 million boda cycles, part of a very, very effective economic sector. But what has happened? Because of the Egypt mentality, we see very many workers in that industry who are exploited by their owners of the motorcycle. Because of the desert mentality, we see very many motorcycle owners who are just concerned about how much they can make for today. And because of the fallen nature that we have as human beings, a lot of our hospitals have what they call the border ward, very many broken people. I have witnessed in the last 2 or 3 years several people who've lost their lives, some of them known very well to me, through motorcycle accidents. So if you are in that industry, how can you become a redemptive agent? And I thank God there are many Christians today who are thinking about it. A, how do you create discipline? Training, how do you create assets? Not just the motorcycle as an asset, but the mindset of the motorcycle driver, educating them, teaching them how to drive, how to keep the rules, how to keep discipline. Safety, like helmets. How do you create a context where the cost of running a motorcycle becomes cheaper? And I thank God for friends who are looking at ways of putting electric motors on motorcycles. But then how do you ultimately make that tool into industry, into something that brings life, not death? How do you bring about order, not disorder? And we look at a country like Rwanda, and we see that in the system, or in that economy, the government has stepped in and created laws to allow people to ride safely on the borders. So I don't know what your industry is. How are you acting as a redemptive agent? So a biblical economy focuses on how do we manage and relate to money individually, but also the biblical economy, the word economy is oikos nomos, or household management. How do we relate to money as families? And if we can handle money as families, then the nations is sorted out. The family economy becomes central to how nations thrive. So I look forward to discussing with you about how you, especially in this season of elections, can begin to discern the different options being given to us by your local leaders and your national leaders on how we are going to see Kenya's economy flourishing. It is God's desire that every nation flourishes. It is God's desire that every nation is blessed. But the key to that blessing is the seed of Abraham, you and I, who are called by God's name. As goes the nation, so goes the church. I look forward to our discussion.
Well, well, well. I love that. As goes the church, so goes the nation. And indeed, that poverty mindset that our brother Dennis spoke about, do you have it as an individual? Do we have it as a community? Do we have it as a nation? If I may just pick 2 quotations from the Bible here. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is Matthew chapter 6, verse 21. Another one is, no one can serve 2 masters. And this is a quotation by Jesus in the Bible. No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. It is said that money is God's rival in the human heart. Our meaning, our sense of value, and our sense of security all depend on money and the things that we own. Although this should not be so. Security, people will argue, can be found in money and things. Or do we find it in God? So, what is first in your life? Is it money or is it God? Thank you so much, Dr. Donggoy, for such an insightful presentation. And just the whole context of the Egypt or the other one of the desert or the promised land. One has asked, those 3 perspectives, can they exist together at the same time? Do we have it? in our minds as individuals, as a community, as a nation. And here let us look at Kenya. Where are we at Kenya? Predominantly, we say basic statistics tell us that we are a youthful nation. You know, over what, 60, 70% of the population is youthful? Park that. We also see, or we're told, we're a Christian, predominantly Christian nation, 80%. Now, when I look at us being a relatively youthful nation, society, but at the same time, 80% Christian, whether or not we actually follow it and live it is a story for another day. But the statistics also, the research that you shared, it may be dated 3, 4, 5 years, but I think it is as relevant today, if not more than ever before. 40% of the youth, the research was telling us, they go to work to steal, right? The other 40%, if they got a chance to steal, they would do so. So are we a hopeless case in Kenya?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Conrad. Let me respond to your questions in several ways. First of all, I'd like to make one correction. We are 80% religious, not godly.
Religious, there's a difference there.
And I think next week I will be talking about godliness and being religious. The Old Testament is full of religious people who offer the right sacrifices at the temple, but their hearts are not right with God. And that is why the quote you had earlier on, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, is very critical from Jesus, because our hearts really must, whatever prosperity, whatever economic system we have, whether it's the desert system or the Egypt system or the promised land, what is common among those things is our heart focused on worshiping the God of the Creator God. So in whichever of those situations, the central thing must be our worship and obedience to God. Now, there are also seasons of life. People come from different economic seasons, but the question is that, are we be able to progress to the next level? So the issue to me is not a question of, was I born poor, but do I have the opportunity to create value, to participate in the building a bigger cake, rather than having a zero-sum mentality of Egypt or the desert. Is an abundance mentality. How do I create wealth? I'll give you an example. I've never heard anybody talk about Bill Gates as bloody rich. Because he's rich, yes, but in his creating wealth, how many millionaires has he created? But when you look at a Kenyan rich people within this country, we often say, look at that bloody rich person, and we think he exploited us to get rich. And that really is the Egypt mentality. But if that person created jobs, in fact, in one forum which I participate in, we said, if we could create a Safaricom every 5 years in Kenya, how many people will come out of poverty? It's not about creating small businesses, but major businesses that can drive thousands of people to participate in an economy. It is wealth creation, it is value addition. And that's really what I think is what God intended in Genesis chapter 1, about being multipliers of wealth. And then the other thing I also want to distinguish is the difference between money and assets or capital. Money is just a means of exchange. But what we're looking at is giving people assets and capital so they can create their own wealth. Money becomes the means that allows us to exchange those assets and those money. So the focus on money on itself is very, very sad, because money loses value over time. Without assets, we just become poorer. So, and one of the challenges we have in this country is most people who have money keep it in the bank. It's not circulating. So you become rich, so you can put the money in the bank so you can look at it. It's not creating wealth for others. So what we like to look at in the kingdom economy is how do we use the assets we have to create value for people, so that more and more people can create livelihoods, can have more food on the table, can have more value in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of social capital.
So this is interesting because, and I'm looking at it within the Kenyan context. And in fact, there is a viewer here who was asked, how do you deal with an economy that is bedeviled with corruption? I mean, this certainly must be speaking to Kenya.
Okay, first of all, I hear that, but we tend to forget that what the press does is often magnify the negative cases. there are very many positive cases of people who are not corrupt, but we never hear the story. And I would really say, I think we as a church need to start sharing the testimony of those who are not corrupt. There is very little space within our worship services on Sundays to share the testimonies of those who are not corrupt. So the narrative we have, the loudest narrative, is only for those who actually are corrupt. And then, of course, it feeds on itself. The negative narrative now begins to affect the values of those who hear. But we can change that story by sharing the testimonies, the stories of those who are not corrupt. And it does not take 100 people, it just takes one person. God told Jeremiah, I went up and down the streets of Jerusalem and looked for one person whose heart was right. I will not destroy the nation. It's not about democracy. It's about being a witness and being present within an industry, within a community where you're doing things God's way.
And indeed, just again, another, a comment from a viewer. And please, let's get interactive. Share on the platform, chat. Yep. So goes the church, so goes the nation. What happens to a nation like ours that is 80% Christian, and you've clarified here and qualified that it is religious, quote unquote, yet cannot give a common standpoint on matters that affect the nation economically as we move towards the general election. In fact, I think this is really a call, so to speak, an expectation that the church must be in the forefront in speaking up, in highlighting and providing platform to, the ways in which we should be doing things. That is redemptive, God's way, sacrificial service. I sacrifice, you win. So if we have that as how we relate with each other, then you find that it's not about reading bank balances with many zeros, but how it is circulating, how we're creating wealth, and not just millionaires for millionaires' sake. And are you then suggesting, because all manner of promises are being given in this electioneering period, left, right, and center. We go, or we see, or we read rallies, thousands upon thousands, and promises being made by our political leaders. Tapping into, again, Kenya statistics, where it is said more than 40, 50, 60, 70% live on less than $1 a day. That is trying to qualify that, again, we are basically poverty-stricken. Be that as it may, how one wants to interpret it. The average person, they just want to get their money, their hand on money, to get by today, to get by now. So they become vulnerable. And then if you tell me, from tomorrow, I'll give you 10,000 shillings in your pocket, or I'll create this or the other. And I'm not trying to judge or balance or speak for Eddie. Is there a challenge there? Is there a problem? What should our leaders be speaking, and what should we be listening to? What's your challenge? What's your call to individuals? What's your call to the community? What's your call to the nation? And how does the church fit in this?
Okay, first of all, as I shared in my talk, that when you look at the book of Hebrews, it talks about Jesus' priesthood not being after the order of Aaron, but after the order of Melchizedek. That's very, very critical. Now I'm a reverend. I'm not saying the church has done anything. It's just that the church has been focused on the altar, what some will call the pulpit ministers, rather than the marketplace ministers. The church ought to be a place which we equip people to go and create value in God's creation, based on Genesis chapter 1. So there needs to be a paradigm shift within the church, not as a collection point of the tithes to the Aaronic priesthood, but the tithe that Abraham gave to Melchizedek. He gave a tenth of everything else for justice and peace. So a kingdom economy would be the church needs to stand for two things: justice and peace, just relationships and peaceful coexistence. Because a kingdom economy is about relationships. Now, when I say that, I don't talk about justice, not the same as equality. It's equity, because we're all different. But all of us should have opportunities to be able to grow the cake together. We're gifted differently. So the church should provide opportunity where those who are accumulating for themselves are called out, and those who are creating value for others are celebrated. So we begin to have a culture of people having a value of creating value for others, because people have different gifts, we're different seasons of life. Those who are just coming out of school cannot be compared to those who've been in the marketplace for 20 years. But the question is that, what is this value for this person who's been out 20 years? And what is the value of the person who's just coming out of school? So in this season of elections, I think we should be looking not at what I call a photograph, but a movie, okay? Where are we going, not where are we? Who is going to get us, who has the best systems to create assets? And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about assets that generate value so that people's lives are changed, not just money. Money is just one means, but assets create long-term sustainable development.
And indeed, I like that, because then those who will say, oh, the church cannot be involved in politics. No, separate. The church cannot be involved in business, because one then sees it from a lens of profiteering, profit's sake, and then they would feel, no, the church should not speak in that space. But you're calling out and saying, the church must be involved. We are part and parcel of life. We have a role to play. So your comment then on the opportunities that the church can give, must give, and to speak to the kind of mindsets and how we're also playing a part in that movie as opposed to a snapshot of being static in one place.
Yep. I think first of all, Conrad, let me qualify the word church, because that's a very confused term. When most people hear church, they think of clergy. Okay? The church is not the clergy. The church is the body of Christ, the people of God.
Right.
And each of them have specific callings, specific roles. There are those whom God has called to the pulpit and to the altar, and they're very, very valuable. But there are also those God has called into other contexts, called into other domains, the health domain, the business domain, the political domain, the education domain. They are equally called. And so I think once the church begins to realize, or we begin to realize the church is not the clergy, then we realize that the clergy equip us, prepare our hearts, and give us values in order for us to bring about God's kingdom in whichever sphere God has placed us. A friend of mine said, God has placed his people where he wants them to be, but are they God's people where they are? Because we only church on Sunday, then on Monday we cease being church. That's why I quoted my Proverbs at All Saints, who say the service has ended, church begins tomorrow.
Very powerful indeed.
Yep.
And I'm just looking at the book, very powerful, Mixing God with Money, that you have. And I would encourage those out there, DennisDonggoy.com, can order there. Over 10,000 copies published and being translated right now, you said, into
Arabic and French.
Arabic and French.
Yep.
Now, just a very quick glance at this. I'm seeing there is the need to budget, how to budget, reflecting on your values and purpose in life, because all these cannot be, seen away from that wholesome, how in that biblical kingdom economy, how they all mix with each other. Speak to the person, to the family. Where and how should one relate and see, and just make it practical and applicable to the individual?
Okay, I think first of all, as I mentioned in the book, Jesus spoke, actually the Bible has over 2,300 verses that talk about money.
2,300
verses. I actually have a book on my bookshelf that actually has all those verses in one book. And so the Bible does talk about money. Yes. And today, talk about money as answer to everything, which is our topic for today. The lie that Satan has given the church or Christians is don't talk about money. The Bible says don't love money, but it doesn't mean don't talk about money.
Yes.
Okay? Love God. The second thing we need to realize is that Jesus spoke more about money than he did about heaven and hell combined. Because Jesus, out of his culture, the Jewish economic model was such that the Greek word koinonia, which we translate into fellowship in English, has got to do with how we share together materially and money terms. You cannot be a worship of God without talking about how we're doing financially. So one of the Jewish rabbis I've been listening to online talks about the biggest use of money a Jew could do was to help somebody else economically. Now, unfortunately, the only message we talk about, again, in the Aaronic altar is bring money to the church, which is important, and there is a place for that. But how do we talk about how we as Christians organize our money to create wealth for others? How do you organize around businesses? And this is where we at Root to Fruit found out that being Christian is not enough. Coming together in business just because the Christians is not enough. We find that a lot of businesses collapse because of dysfunctional relationships, even among Christians, because we don't share the same values. First of all, we don't have a biblical perspective on the values that should drive our business. Secondly, if we do, they're not in alignment. And so we find even most Christians who try and do business or create wealth together end up being isolated because they have no, what I call social capital. They're unable to work together, which is what actually keeps us in poverty. Because if we're going to grow the economy of Kenya, we must learn to collaborate. Now, it begins with the education system. And I thank God that the government is now, has changed the education system, where we're taught to compete, okay? I boasted because I was number 1, you're number 3, you're number 4, and each time you went home, your parents ask you, what number were you this year? Now, in life, you don't compete. Many marriages break apart because husband is competing with wife. It's about collaboration. And economies are built by collaboration, not by competition. So that even the person with the least contribution contributes to the health of that economy. And with the light touch, the COVID-19 taught us that the most important person in the bank is not the bank manager, is the cleaner who sweeps the floor, because then the floors are clean and it doesn't get COVID. Okay?
Yes.
That sweeper is just as much value as the bank manager.
Yes.
Because all of us are creating an economic model where we're interdependent. And that is what a kingdom economy looks like. But for that to happen, we need to start, as God's people, start asking ourselves, what is it the Bible talks about kingdom values? Because the kingdom values bring about healed relationships and collaboration.
Wow. I mean, again, COVID with all its challenges definitely did not surprise God. There's a reason why COVID happened.
Yep.
And in a sense, give us a sense of factory reset to appreciate the very basics and appreciation that everybody has a role to play and we all are valued. All are valued. Speak to the youth of this nation.
Yep. Okay, first of all, I've been having some robust discussions with the youth, and there's a perception that the reason why there are no jobs is because the Wazees have taken it. But statistically, like people of my age are only 3% of Kenya. So even if we all dropped dead today, and COVID has killed many of us, what has changed? So the youth of this country need to realize that they are gifted and made in God's image. They need to realize that God's kingdom has an abundance mindset where those of us who are created in God's image are actually value creators. And like I said in my presentation, business is about solving problems. Solving problems sustainably. So if you can start looking at the problems in your community and looking for ways to solve those problems, to use technical language, doing a market survey, what are the problems you can actually meet? You can actually find ways in which you can actually employ yourself to where you're able to provide services, knowledge, and skills to other people. Secondly, in generations gone by, the asset which most people fought for was land. But today, one of the biggest assets is the website, being online. Online assets are global. You're not limited to a small piece of land in Maragoli or in Muranga, but you can actually create assets that are actually global. So think of yourself as a young person is, how do I create assets? You as an asset to yourself, how do you educate yourself, build your skills, build your capacity, so that you actually become a better producer, because God wants us to be productive. The promised land, God wants us to be productive. And then how do you create assets in terms of things that solve problems for other people?
And that lack of faith, there are those who then would accumulate and want to, you look at yourself and say, this is how I came up, these are challenges that I had, and I want to provide for and start accumulating, and it's all vanity. You accumulate that then nurtures and encourages corruption, and hide it in all manner of places and form for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 generations down the road. Someone gave a quote, and with due respect to the ones who are passing on, that you came into this world with nothing and you'll depart with nothing. And when your time comes to get off the stage and we go and read your bank balance and see all those billions that Dr. Donggoy left behind, it's really indicative of what you didn't do with what you had in terms of opportunity. So, again, just a very quick comment on those who accumulate for the sake of accumulating, because then that again nurtures instability in a nation.
Yeah. Conrad, I shared on earlier on how we want to look at systems, and Jesus told us to disciple the nations, and I shared how Satan deceives the nations. And the lie that Satan has planted to entrap people is greed and fear. Most people's lives are driven by greed and fear. The Bible says over 365 times, do not fear. So if the reason why you go to work is you're afraid of the future, it actually means you don't even enjoy today. So you have actually dead.
Yes.
God has promised us, and Jesus taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. And God has structured life so that no human being can live more than one day at a time. So whatever economic level you have today, God is asking us to live in faith and love, not greed and fear. Even those who do not have can learn to love somebody else and share what they have. Begin by giving, sharing. I know many people who have a scarcity mindset say, I'm poor, I've got little, and I can do nothing. But when that mindset is changed to an abundance mindset, they realize I have something to offer. I may have little, but I can share it with somebody else. And that's now what begins their upward mobility, is sharing what little they have. Because generosity is a kingdom value. Generosity is not only for those who have, it's for all of us. And we don't only give material things, we give ourselves.
And you're unpacking, because the giving doesn't necessarily need to be tangible, as it were. Just, there's Anthony Jero on Facebook, thank you very much. And he says, I quote, I like the idea of connecting economy as part of a person's whole life and responsibility to God. So here's the question. What practical programs within church can we begin to engender this idea?
Thank you very much, Conrad, because for many years, and I did actually speak to some of your leaders, particularly in some of the churches, we have a very well-developed choir ministry, very well-developed finance, but do you have a stewardship team at church? I think every church should develop a stewardship team. It's the people who are trained in financial literacy, who can train others. Because handling and creating wealth is not innately natural. And by God's grace, through CMS Africa, where I worked, we have a training called Financial Freedom for Families, where we take churches, individuals, through biblical principles, and that's what my book addresses, Mixing God with Money, that helps individuals learn how to first of all, stop losing money. If one of my friends says, you go into a house and all the taps are open, okay? So we first of all help you to shut off all the taps where you're leaking, where you're wasting your life and your resources, to where you actually start to save and start creating value. And the typical result has been, within 6 months to a year, the average church member now has surplus in their savings and are looking for ways in which to use it productively. But very few of us have financial literacy. So the challenge I have is, can churches begin stewardship programs? And again, if you get in touch with me on the website, we can actually link you up with people who can train you individually or as communities or as groups to become better stewards of the resources. Stewardship is very, very biblical from Genesis 1, all the way from Genesis 1, where mankind was given the stewardship mandate. So churches need to have, apart from choirs, every church must have a stewardship team that is trained and equipped to help people financially and to counsel people when the money matters.
Indeed. And wow, that is awesome. So practical stewardship immediately in churches as ministry that cuts across, not just necessarily those who are in quote-unquote business per se, but right across empowerment to the individual, to the family, of course, then that cascades to the nation.
Yeah. And Conrad, let me give you some examples, because by the grace of God, I've done this for many years. We have several churches who are doing amazingly well in empowering their members. One church, I was part of Carol Community Chapel, has a website, has a WhatsApp group of business people where we actually do business online with each other. If you want anything, if you want to buy a tie clip tomorrow, I can actually post on that right now and have somebody who get it to me. If I need a worker for anything you need, the church members themselves are doing business with each other. So they're not just going to church together, they're doing business with each other. I know, for example, in Deliverance Church in Sili, where I've done a lot of work, they have performed together circles, business savings, where they actually work together, they invest together. They actually have an insurance policy together, where they actually bargain using the bargaining power. And I know banks, churches have talked about one particular group that I actually have this documented, has actually begun savings and credit thing where they lend money to one another without interest. All this is happening because Christians are realizing we must be economically engaged. And there's several churches that are doing this. Like I mentioned earlier, we only hear of the corrupt people. We don't hear of the people who are doing good. And I think we and Hope FM, in terms of editorial policy, we must start celebrating those who are doing well.
Well, again, wonderful. There's a chat here. This is from Uninzioka. Uninzioka, thank you very much. And this is a chat on the YouTube. And he thanks Reverend Dr. Donggoy. Very informative. Indeed, financial literacy and stewardship programs are necessary in churches. So the church should not shy away and say, leave that to the business programs out there. They must get involved in it. Wow. As the church goes, so the nation goes.
Yes.
The quote that you said, that you had, I think from the provost of All Saints,
yes,
who said on Sunday that
the service is over, church begins tomorrow.
Church begins tomorrow.
Yes, yeah.
and that then basically, my unpacking of the same is that when we leave the kingdom values, it's not to go to church as a building to congregate on a Sunday or Saturday, for those who do it on Saturday or any other day, to tick a box, to then say, I've done my bit, so now let me continue, and then let me do business with God in a timetable way. It is lifestyle. It is part and parcel of us. What challenge or what solution do we see when you look at Kenya as a nation? Again, electioneering period, when we are interrogating all these manifestos, what should we be looking for? Because the government that we elect in terms of leadership creates the enabling environment. Because again, if the enabling environment isn't there, then again, challenges manifest themselves. What should we be looking for?
I think somebody once said, the cream rises to the top. And it is my prayer that we can create a system which allows the cream to rise to the top. That is, our best managers, our best leaders, our best role models become those who actually lead this nation. There is a mystery about Kenya. In fact, I normally joke whenever I go to visit my friends in the US, I introduce myself as Dennis from Kenya, and I'm not a runner. Because the world perceives Kenyans as runners.
Very stereotypes.
Now, I'm privileged to be seen as a runner, but what happened? In 1968, one Kipchoge Keino showed us it was possible to win the 3,000-meter steeplechase. Since that time, and I think only once in history since then, have we ever lost that race. Because he set the standard is actually possible. He was a positive role model. Unfortunately, what we have today is negative role models. So what I'd say, as we go into electioneering, to me, rather than attacking one another, is promoting positive role models, sharing stories, and then allowing those positive role models to rise to the top. So as you look at your leaders, ask yourself, in which way have they been value creators? In which way have they created the promised land paradigm of shared prosperity, as opposed to the Egypt of exploitation? Or just the ethical? We're just looking for ethical people who have done nothing wrong, looking for people whose lives have created value for others. Now, unfortunately, because of the Egypt mentality, we tend to make decisions based upon today. So then we become very susceptible to only giving our voice to those who bribe us on the day before the election. And by the way, we know in Kenya, all this noise we're making, it's the day before the election that's going to count.
Indeed. Yes,
so
yes.
I would urge people to think beyond their stomachs, to think beyond the desert and Egypt, to think about value creation and how we can become stewards of a better country, not just for ourselves, but for the coming generations. And in fact, in that passage in Deuteronomy chapter 11, it begins by, teach your children and then it talks about and their children. We must think about creating generational wealth. And this is why I talk about even having money in my bank account should not be about myself. Should be how do I create generational wealth? And this is where, again, I talk about assets. Again, some of us agree, some of us differ about all these assets we're creating in Kenya, like the railway line, the roads, everything. Those are assets that our children are going to use. So let's think about people who are asset creators, not those people who are asset depleters.
Indeed. Wow. We could have gone on and on. Stay tuned. Hope TV is the place to be. Thank you so much, Dr. Donggoy, and I believe we're with you next week.
Yes, by God's grace.
By God's grace, we are with you next week, and we'll continue unpacking and being relevant to you. And we just want to thank you for the privilege of your time. This has been The Leader on Hope TV and the social media platforms. Till next week, stay tuned. Goodbye. God bless.